Well, Janny brought a lot of memories back to me. I can remember one story. I don't know who told me most of these stories, but when Roland was first in the logging camps in, I think, Minnesota or somewhere, I recall that I think he told me that he'd held every job in a logging camp except high rigger and camp cook. But one of the fun stories, I think when he worked for Governor Clough, before Governor Clough was the governor, he was sent off to Cass Lake, and I thought it was Minnesota, but was that north?
Minnesota,
Yeah, to take over the logging operations there, and he chose a Sunday to arrive, and he walked into town dressed up as a minister with a reversed collar and a Bible under his arm. And he checked into the only hotel in town and went up to his room, and then he ordered room service and some whiskey. Well, this was just shocking. And so every 20 minutes or so, he'd order another drink of whiskey. And no one knew him in the whole town of Cass Lake. And he just kept ordering one every 20 minutes or so. And apparently about 6 o'clock that night, the whole town of Cass Lake was gathered around the hotel waiting for this drunken minister to walk out. and he walked out with his Bible under his arm and said, "Peace be with you," and walked off. And then I recall Mom telling me that when he first announced that he and Nina were going to be married, David Clough said, "Roland, she's just a baby." 16 years old. Is that right? She was 16. And then I never knew the Cloughs, but I remember, I think Addie was a Christian Scientist. And then when she was dying, the line my mom told me is that David Clough said, "Addie, you're going to have a doctor." But my recollection of Roland was the practical joker. He had every time I came in, I'd say, "Ooda, ooda, Bapits, Bapits." And so we'd go down to the basement and chop wood. And he had a great big axe sharpening with the little wheel. It tapped like that, like a Singer sewing machine. And little funnel with, you'd put water in it and it would drip on the thing, and he'd get there. He and I would sharpen the axes, cut the wood. Then we'd come upstairs, and he had a penknife that had little scissors in it. So then he would sit down in the living room and ask me to cut his hair out of his ears with his little scissors. And then right down in the coat closet, he was a real practical joker. He had some kind of a thing with 2 dry cell batteries. I remember they seemed to be like 6 or 8 inches high and maybe 3 inches in diameter, hooked up to a little tray with water in it, and he'd put a silver dollar in the water and offer me the opportunity to have that silver dollar. I never did get it. And then I remember a story being told that when he was governor, he had to witness a hanging. Some criminal got hung, and he didn't like that very much, but apparently he had to do it. And he came back to, I don't know if it was that night or a couple of nights later, and he was up in the middle of the night and walked into the kitchen reaching up for a pull cord for the light, and he bumped into the maid in the middle of the dark. He thought he was dead. That kind of, let's see. Well, of course, we remember the round table out in the garage. That was always great fun. And then, Gene, were you ever, or Janny, were you ever involved when he'd come home when he was governor and he had a Pierce Arrow with a red light and a siren on the Pierce Arrow?
I remember.
And apparently on Sunday mornings he would get all the neighborhood kids packed into the Pierce Arrow with the top down and crank up the siren and the red light and drive around Everett going past every church service. Did you hear that?
He took us in the Pierce Arrow at the mansion down in Olympia. He'd give us a very small amount of money, which we thought was a lot, and we'd drive down to the hotel to spend our money on penny candy, which was a thrill, and the sirens going.
I remember Mom talking about the bats in the governor's mansion.
Yeah, they did. They continued to have them.
Yeah.
There's another joke I can tell about the Minnesota Hartleys who came to visit, and they drove up from Pasadena, I think. They had probably gone to see Wilder in Pasadena, and he was governor at the time, and he sent the state patrol down there to greet them at the border, and he said it was Guilford Hartley, his brother, and he said, Mr. Hartley, you're to follow me directly to the Capitol. And so they had him escorted under, with the sirens and lights the whole way. And my cousin Jean Paul, who was married, a different Paul that now lives in Florida, she said they were all just mortified by this. And then when they arrived, he was just laughing his head off. It was just hilarious to him. So he loved that lights and siren action.
Oh.
Harley, I'm kind of glad you brought that story up. Is the microphone coming over? Yeah. Oh, there it is. Because I think he, being the governor, and he could have the lights in the car, the siren, whatever it was, but I'm pretty sure, because this came from my grandfather, Edward Hartley, but he had the authority to do so because here's his Washington State Highway Patrol badge.
That's great. Stories are flipping in and out of my head. I had a few. I've got a good memory. It's just a little short. One of the fun things that existed in this room. Oh, here's Mary Pelly Fitzgerald. And Jennifer.
The birthday girl.
Woohoo. And Kate. And Greg. I don't remember who told me all these stories, but I assume they're fairly true. But this was the attic, and Sanford told me that it had a lower ceiling, which is what kind of faked me out here a minute. But Roland is somewhat like me. Betty and I have an attic in our house that's about 2,000 square feet, and it's full. And I can tell you this attic was full when Roland died, and there were reams and reams and reams of paper with his Roland H. Hartley governor on it. And I don't know how many stacks, but when I was at Lakeside, my English professor, teacher, I guess, in high school was Vernon Parrington, whose father, Parrington Hall at the University of Washington, was one of the muckrakers in the 20s and 30s. And so they were major Democrats. And Vernon Parrington was a major Democrat. And so I had all of Roland's speeches, carbon copies, and the states printed out copies of all of his, his state messages, that sort of thing, and 8 volumes of his veto messages. And so, and I also had about 3 volumes of newspaper articles. So I had the actual speech, and I also had the newspaper's reporting of what he said. And it was 180 degrees opposite. The Seattle Times was Colonel Blethyn of the Times. And some of Roland's speeches were, well, Colonel Blethyn. And he came to report to me in the governor's office, and he squared up and clicked his heels. Oh, I was just sick. But anyway, one of the things that Colonel Blethyn was yakking about in the Seattle Times was that Roland was advocating making speedways out of the state highways. Well, what he was advocating was banking the corners. If you go up to, Granite Falls and so on, you see some of the old highway turns are absolutely flat, no bank at all. And when he was governor, was the time they bought the land to build the highway from Seattle to Everett, and Roland advocated as Highway 99. And it was all just farmland, and he recommended buying enough land to make the highway 10 lanes wide. And the Democrats controlled the legislature and said, no, it's going to be 4. So now we have a strip city highway 99, 4 lanes wide. Another good one, I think, was when they were building the Highway 99 from Everett up to Vancouver to take away the old Chuckanut Drive, which was the only way to get to Vancouver. And I think my recollection is that the Highway Commission had the governor plus 2 Democrats. And each time they came to a river, Roland would advocate building a bridge 4 lanes wide. And these 2 Democrats, no, you're wasting the state's money, make it 2 lanes. So when they came to one river, and Roland suggested that he led his underlings or his staff or his secretary to lead these guys to believe that he was finally going to give up and vote for a 2-lane bridge. So one of them voted for a 4-lane bridge, and of course Roland did too. And that's the southbound lanes on I-5 over the Stillaguamish River. Didn't have to rebuild it. And what was really amazing, apparently, in all of these years, he was fighting. The Democrats controlled the legislature, and I don't remember the details, but the state school lands, the timberlands, were sold off at auction, and these Democrats apparently were rigging the bids so that they'd get it at nothing. And for example, Roland had his own timber cruiser go out and cruise some of this timber that 30 years before had been cruised at, say, 40 million board feet, and it was purchased at 20 million board feet, and his cruise showed it was 80 million board feet. Stuff like that was going on. And in 1928, I think it was, maybe 26, when they were building the Capitol buildings in Olympia, the Temple of Justice and the legislative buildings and so on, every bid was rigged. Same as they're doing with Sound Transit and the highways around here. Same thing. Nothing's changed. And Roland was blowing the whistle, and the Times was in league with the Democrats, and the old Seattle Star newspaper was the only one that was reporting the facts accurately. And I can tell you this because, I was writing this in high school. Oh, I forgot to tell you. I was writing my themes on the back side of Roland's letterhead. Handing it in to Vernon Parrington. I couldn't resist. It was so classic. Anyway, so Roland was just yakking away and finding facts like crazy about all these rigged bids, and it didn't matter. It was all wired. So finally, the last request for bid documents were out for building the Capitol buildings, and it was all the brass railings and the doorknobs and the cuspidors and the window hardware and the door hardware and the chandeliers. And he somehow got a set of the request for bid documents, and unbeknownst to the bid riggers, sent it back east to a company that he knew of and asked them to be a secret bidder. And this East Coast company came in and bid, unbeknownst to the Democratic bid riggers. This is the huge chandeliers. Have you ever seen those things in Olympia? They're beautiful. Anyway, the East Coast company won the bid. They were the low bidder. It was Tiffany's.
Are you finished with that story?
Do you want me to give the speech now?
I do want you to give the
speech, but I have one more that's similar because I heard, I understood, and I never met Roland, I'm just his great-granddaughter, but but I heard that they literally would go out on the bandwagon all across Washington State. And I understood that Roland was the first governor to be in the black from the red.
Oh, I think so.
And he was very conservative with budget and whatnot. But he was also the first governor to be the governor of the governor's mansion.
I'm not sure of that.
I'm pretty sure. And they spent all sorts of money on brass spittoons that were $100 a piece, and chairs that were $500. And he went with Uncle Edward and Grandpa Hartley literally on the bandwagon across the Washington State, and had a chair and a brass spittoon, and he said, for anybody that wouldn't be able to sit in a $500 chair and spit in a brass spittoon, here is your opportunity.
That's terrific.